All right, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to talk tonight about this subject. Basically, I want to talk about the concept of a name in Christianity and why I think it's so important. And hopefully I can show you something significant tonight. So let's just start with a brief recap from a 10,000 foot overview, just recalling, sort of where we've been going. So if you guys remember 2 weeks ago, basically the whole project here that I've started out was basically trying to understand the notion and the function of truth in Christianity, trying to understand what it means to worship the Word, trying to establish a connection between Christ and the Word and truth and what that all means. So this is like the orienting principle, right? So, and then the most important thing I think that we took away from that first week was basically that we're defining the Christian as the guy that worships truth. And then as a consequence of that, we realized that there's something that's in us that acts upon us, that orients us in the world, that motivates the way that we act, and that also indicates to us that we actually have something inside of us that's given to us that has structure. And it's by means of that existing structure within us that we use to, say, navigate the world, perceive structure in the world. And then truth is sort of the object outside of us that orients us, right? Last week I tried to argue that it has four principal properties, namely that it orients us, that we live it, that it's a unique solution in some sense to what it is to be human, and that it purifies us, or it sanctifies us, or makes us, it ennobles us, brings us higher. But we can sort of flip this whole thing on its head and think about it from the subjective perspective, or the introverted point of view, and you ask the question, like, how does this manifest inside of us? And at the end of last week, I read John 10:1-5, and I'm going to read it once more, because that's the thing that I think really is going to motivate tonight's discussion. And Jesus is giving a parable, and he says this: I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. So the thing here that I want to point to is that basically Jesus is alluding to the fact that the way that we hear God is as a unique sort of resonance inside of us. Okay, and if we take this like loosely, if we take this with the sort of conclusion that we're trying to establish from week 1, we see that sort of the action of the Spirit in us is like God calling to us, or the name that God has given to us. And what I'm trying to do tonight is argue to you that that's the case. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to look at what happens when you become aware of that thing, and what happens when you start to articulate that thing. Okay. Okay, so what I want to do is just briefly outline the way that this is going to go. And so last week I kind of set up this structure. Wow. Here we go. Last week I set up this kind of structure where I sort of, that looks terrible. I set up this kind of structure last week where I sort of drew a line like this, and I said I want to think about the psychological stuff over here, and I want to think about the religious stuff over here. And then what I want to do is I want to establish a type of connection like this. So I think that this is the primary way where we can make sense of this stuff, because this stuff is often hidden in parables. And this stuff is in principle supposed to be something scientific. And so I think that if we juxtapose these 2 points of view, then we can actually see something, we can try and glean something out of all of these sort of structures that we're dealing with, okay? So if I take a step back and I look at just this religious point of view, if you look at some of the most prominent areas where names are spoken to men by God or by men of God. The first one that you see, the most prominent ones that you see are when Abram becomes Abraham, Jacob becomes Israel, and Simon becomes Peter. And all three of these situations correspond to a significant transformation in those people. And what I want to do is explore the nature of that transformation so that we understand what happens when God calls us. Like when we hear the name God has given to us, what it does to us. Okay. The next one that I want to look at is, okay, of course, we're looking at imperfect men in the first example, so we're getting a better sense about what happens to us. If we take the second example here and we look at the Transfiguration of Christ, well, I'm going to try and argue that it's a consequence of his name being spoken. But what happens there is something like a transformation of the precise embodiment of God, right? And so in some sense, it's like the archetypal or idealized representation of what happens when your name is spoken. Okay? And so this is sort of like the fundamental ideal that we're trying to point to. So like these things are sort of specific instantiations of something that's happening here that's more transcendental, like in the sense that I've been speaking about. And then the last thing that I want to do is I want to juxtapose the difference between this idea of name and law. And in particular, I want to point to some of the things that Paul says. Because in the book of Romans, he makes a big hullabaloo about us being freed from the law. And there's some surprising connection there, which, if there's no etymological overlap between these two concepts, I'm very surprised. However, even if there's no etymological overlap, I think that the way those words sound, especially in Greek, makes the connection a lot clearer, which is, again, very surprising, but we'll get there. All right, so that's going to differentiate this right-hand side for us, right? We're going to get a good picture of what the religious notion of name-calling is. That sounds like we're in preschool. Yeah. But then if you look at it from the psychological point of view, a priori, I suppose it's not exactly obvious what that would correspond to, but I think that Jung does a really good job of articulating how this manifests psychologically. I don't go too deep into it because I think that the quote that I pull from him makes it sufficiently obvious what his ideas are on the point. But I mean, maybe you guys will want to stop me there and we can ask more questions about it. Because there's a lot that could be said there that I kind of just gloss over. Yeah. And I really want to tie it to this idea of like your work, your purpose in some sense. Yeah, because often I think that the way that we think about, say, the notion of purpose these days is very, well, at least it's ill-defined. And perhaps we're a little bit cynical and nihilistic about this notion of us having a purpose these days. And I think it's because there's a separation of this component of us from all other aspects of us, because I do think, well, at least what I'm going to try to argue to you guys tonight is that we actually derive the notion of purpose from this, and that in the absence of this, the interpretation of purpose really doesn't make sense because we don't hold this idea of me having a life work as being something sacred. Like it just seems like, oh, that's just a far-off dream that I'll never be able to achieve, so I'll just sit down, shut up, and do what I'm told. Yeah, and that's stupid, so don't do that. All right, so yeah, and then I want to talk about what it means to experience that thing. Yeah, and then the last piece that what I want to do here is like establish this connection, right, where we think about the true thing, which is going to be up here, as going to be something like the synthesis of these two things. Yeah, I put this little note in here saying that it's technically not dialectical because I'm not setting these things up as opposing, right? And I'm not synthesizing something of a thesis and an antithesis. So this is not Hegelian, okay? Yeah, where's Levere now?
You'll see.
I don't think he's dead yet, but okay. So let's take that step back and let's talk about naming as a transformation. Let's go back to the religious side of things. So let's look at Abraham's transformation. So the way that I always approach this is, again, going back to the first week where I talked to you guys about how we do analysis. You take an idea and you try and pull out principal properties, and then you try to understand what those properties really mean, right? And I think that one of the best ways to do this is, well, what I should say is that I think that what words do is they actually are, they're not completely this, but they are at least signifiers for the collection of ideas that they sort of lump together, something like that, right? And so one of the ways that we can do this is we can look at, say, what the meaning of names are, and then to try and understand, like what is Abram representing when his name is Abram, right? So if you were to say, let me clarify this even farther, right? If I say my name is Ryan, and then I look at what my name is from, my name means little king, right? And so in some sense, I'm supposed to be the representation of the little king, something like this, right? We don't think these ways anymore, but that's where names, I think, come from. So if you think about it in that sense, if Abram means something like high father, we can look at what his name is actually a contraction of. And in Hebrew, it's the contraction of the word father, as well as the word of that corresponds to this notion of rising or raising. And so it seems to me that what he is before he's transformed is something like the father who will be reborn, or the father who will be raised up, which is exactly what happens to him when he gets turned into Abraham, right? He becomes the father of a people through his transformation, right? So, but that means that beforehand he's something like low, he's more human, he's more, what would I say? Profane. And the notion of profane here is not like derogatory. Profane is to be juxtaposed with the notion of sacred, right? And so he's more worldly, he's more of the earth, and I don't mean that again in a sinful way, although I suppose that's sort of where we derive our notion of sin. I just mean it in sort of like he's clay in some sense, He doesn't really have spirit in him, or his spirit is going to be refined by virtue of this transformation. Yes, and so then he has the covenant of circumcision, and it is through that transformation that his name becomes Father of many nations. And surprisingly, I think this right here is the father part, but the second part in that word is actually not well known. And so it's actually speculated that it's of many nations, but it also seems to suggest ideas of propagation, like going forward, right? And so then that means that what he transforms into is something that's supposedly to be redeemed into something which has the capacity to transcend death, right? And so you see here in this initial iteration of this transformation, the first image of Christ, right? Where Christ goes from man to God in his transcendence of death when he's raised back up. Yeah. And then I commented here this, we can compare this with the parable of the talents, right? Where Abraham obviously fulfills his destiny as the one to be reborn. And so he took what was given to him by God, and he made it multitudinous. Okay. Right. So we have this initial iteration. So we have this initial iteration of this type of transformation where when Abram receives his name from God, he becomes transcendent. Okay. And that's encoded in his name. Like literally God gives him the name, you will grow. Right. So, then we can look at Jacob and when he transforms into Israel. So Jacob's story, right, in the beginning when he's born holding Esau's heel, which is why his name means heel catcher or heel holder, right? And by implication, he's the deceiver. So he's sort of manipulative, right? And that also reoccurs in other parts of his story where Esau likes to go out into the world and conquer things and do things. And Jacob likes to stay in his room and hide and read and not be confrontational. Yeah. But again, that means that the name that he is given when he's born is something like somebody who needs to be redeemed in some sense. Or somebody who uses darkness to obtain what he needs or what he wants, right? Oh, but I suppose you should juxtapose that with the fact that he's the one that becomes the nation of God, right? And so, in the absence of this darkness, there's no such redemption arc. There's no need to be reborn, right? And so then the necessity of the darkness inside of us becomes manifest in this particular picture of the transformation. Okay. Yeah. When he wrestles with God, what happens is he runs away, he sends his wife and his maidservants over the river. He sends all of his stuff over the river, and he stays on the other side of the river, and he wrestles with God. Right? He wrestles all night with God, and then he survives. He isn't crushed by God. Right? And so it's like he's confronting God in some sense. And through the confrontation of God, God renames him as basically Prince of Divine Strength. Well, yeah, of course, because if you can withstand the onslaught of God, then yes, you have divine strength, right? So, okay. So in the first picture, we have this idea of going from high to low. In this second picture, what we have is going from dark to light. Okay. All right. Now, those are both already encoded in the Jewish tradition. So even the Jews have this notion of transformation. But I think the thing that demarcates the Jewish point of view from the Christian point of view is that we regard that transcendence as fundamentally sacred. Right? We say that the fact of being transformed is the sacred thing. And I think that the renaming of Simon as Peter makes that clear. Okay? So what Simon actually means is, so Simon is renamed Peter, and when Simon says to Christ, "You are Christ," when Christ asks him, "Who do you think I am?" Okay, so Jesus says, "Who am I?" And Peter confesses, "Well, you're Christ." And he's the first one of the disciples, I think, to say so. And then when he does that, Jesus says to him, "Well, I'm going to rename you. I'm going to name you from Simon to be Peter." Okay? And the name Simon is derived from Hebrew, and it means to hear intelligently, right? And if you're hearing intelligently, then you're listening to the correct words, which you can extrapolate to saying that you're listening to the word, which means that you hear God. Okay? So we have a man who can hear God, and then he becomes the foundation of the church, the rock. Yes.
In the same lexical field as rock, there are other connotations such as this guy's dense. This guy is perhaps no longer walking with God. Not necessarily saying that Simon was walking with God. I don't think the Bible.
Oh, yeah, you mean like hard-headed, things like this. Okay,
right.
sure.
But rock here is foundational?
Yes. So let's go and read that section. Okay, so it says here. This is Matthew 16:13 through 20. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" That's Jesus saying. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." Again, justifying his name as Simon. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Wherever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. So the context there makes it clear that this notion of rock is as foundational. And if you remember last week when I was talking about this idea of truth, and you look at it etymologically from the English point of view, there's idea of hardness, persistence, invariance, right? Yeah, and this word Petros has no etymological origin that we know of right now because it's so old. Yeah, which is kind of ironic, right? Because rocks, it's like rocks were then one of the first things that we could say. Right. Yeah, but actually, this idea of Peter as hard-headed is actually a good point. I think, I don't remember when, but it was during one of the Bible studies that I was at his house, where we were talking about, I was leading that one, and I was talking about Peter as the foundation of the church. And one of the members there, she brought up this idea that Peter actually acts very, I suppose, immaturely. Because if you look at many of the ways that he acts before Christ's crucifixion, he does act in a very immature way. And one of the best examples is when they come to, there are two really good examples. The first example is when they come to arrest Jesus, and instead of Peter deferring to Jesus and saying, yes, it's time. No, the first thing that he does is he pulls his sword out and he cuts somebody's ear off. Okay? Yeah. The other time is just after he confesses Christ. He says, I'm going to die. And Peter says, I will never let that happen to you. And then Jesus says to him, get behind me, Satan. Yeah. And I mean, you can pick a third time too. And the third time is going to be, I'll never deny you, Lord. And then he denies him 3 times. Yeah. Yeah. And all of those things sort of manifest as a sort of Peter falling from grace. And then in the end of John, what happens is Peter's actually reinstated by Christ. And he really properly becomes the foundation of the church at that moment. And then if you compare to the way he acts in Acts, he becomes much more mature, like a real propagator of, the word. Yeah, he really becomes sort of like a true leader, I would say. Especially if you read the way he gives sermons to people in the beginning of Acts, after Pentecost. Okay, so in this first picture, what we have, so let's draw a picture right now. Right, so this naming as transformation right now, we actually have, so Jung makes a big deal out of quaternities. He thinks that that's a fundamental symbol for the manifestation of God. I think there's some evidence in the comparative religion literature that suggests this. Numbers are really complicated. I can't make a strong argument for this right now, but let's just assume it's true. So in one situation, what you have here is you have through Abraham, you have this sort of spiritual transformation from low to high. And then through Jacob, you have a transformation in something like from dark to light. Or another way you could put it is from weak to strong. To Israel. Which incidentally I would say probably pinnacles with David. Yeah. Right, and so this diagram corresponds to the action of God speaking man's name to him, to the man. If you flip that on the other side and you see the situation where man speaks God's name back to God, what happens is the man becomes the foundation of God, of God's manifestation in the world. You see?
You said that one more time.
Yes. So when man, so this is those first two. Right. So this is God transforming man. If I step back and I think about the opposite of this, as man transforming God, the man who hears God's name and says it back to him becomes the foundation of the church, becomes the rock of the church, which means he becomes the principal propagator of the church, of God in the world. He is the manifestation of God in the world, the foundation of all that manifests as God in the world. Right? So to be able to do this, you have to hear God, which means you have to hear the name he's given to you, and then you have to put it into the world. You have to live it. Right? And that's the sacred act that Peter takes when he says, you are Christ. Right? Because Peter's name, Simon's name, means to hear God. Right? And so he's fulfilling his purpose when he confesses Christ. Okay. But this is a great segue into this next part of what happens when you do this. Now, I think there's something highly non-trivial about the fact that between confession of Christ and the Transfiguration, Peter also says, I won't let you die, and then Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. But I haven't been able to figure out the significance of that yet, so we're going to gloss over it. So we're just going to jump straight into the Transfiguration. Whoops. Yeah. So, let me read it. It says here, okay, so the way that the confession of Christ and the prediction of Jesus' prediction of his death read is that this is all happening in one sitting, right? So you have Peter confessing Christ, and then in the same night, Peter saying, I will never let you die, and then Christ saying, get behind me, Satan. And then it says this, after 6 days, so on the 7th day, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud enveloped them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So what happens here? The man who can hear God speaks God's name back to God. And then on the 7th day, God undergoes a transformation. Right? So it seems to me that the parallels to the beginning of Genesis are obvious in this situation. But it's very strange in this situation because it would be as though the formlessness of structure reflected God's name back to God, and that's what incited God to create in the first place. It's like the dual to the initial picture that we get of the nature of God towards man, right? Because we're always thinking of the relationship between God and man as like this, like in that picture over there, where man is the fundamentally low structure and God is the fundamentally high structure. But what we're seeing in this picture is something like an inversion of this. And it seems to me that that's the only point of view that can justify God becoming man in the first place. Right? It's like men who could hear God needed to teach God something that God couldn't understand other than through his name being spoken to him by men who could hear him. Yes. And so the thing that I note here is if you take the parallel to Genesis seriously, it's as though this action, through this action, in some sense, Peter creates God. Which means that if you interpret this for you as hearing your name from God. When you speak the name that you've been given by God, you create God in the world. Yes, and then the other thing that I note here is that this is consistent with the interpretation of Christ as logos. Because what I said is that what Christ does is he facilitates our connection to God. Right? If he is the mechanism by which we understand everything, then through him we see the Father, and we manifest the Father in the world when we leverage him. And in some weird way, it's as though that sanctifies him. And we are sanctified by that process. It's like a loop. It's not this one-dimensional, not this unidirectional thing, right? It doesn't go like this. It's much more like a bijection, much more like a circle, much more like a loop, right? And incidentally, if I erase this arrow here and I take this loop seriously, this is me saying that the foundational thing is transformation as such. That's the thing that's sacred. And that's what we're saying in Christianity is the bedrock, is transformation. Transformation is the sacred thing. And the way you do that is through your inner name, is through articulating your inner name. Right? And so this thing that's in you, that you have been endowed with, that you come into being with, is fundamentally sacred. It's probably the most sacred thing you have. Yeah, and then there's like all of this, this imagery where Christ becomes like the sun, his face shines like the sun, his clothes become white. Obviously, there's a sanctification imagery here, a purification imagery here, right? And if you guys remember back to part 1 where I'm talking about this, maybe it was part 2, where I'm talking about this idea of a symbol, which is like an idea but also has an affective structure to it, an emotional structure to it. It's like Christ is going from this piece of clay to this ideal structure, and so he becomes a symbol. Right? And so you might even argue that in the process of his transfiguration, he's more completely embodying the Logos, or he's reflecting the Logos back at these people. Yeah. Yeah. There's something quite peculiar, like John being there and Peter being there makes sense. But the fact that James is there too is something I think that's kind of peculiar. Because John is, of course, the one that Jesus loves, and Peter is the rock of the church. So who is James? I'm not sure. That's an open question. Right? Because what you do need men who can hear God and who God loved to be able to articulate him as a symbol in order for him to propagate into the world. To be able to use that symbol appropriately. Right? It's like if the Pythagoreans, for example, never shared their idea, or no one could understand what Pythagoras was saying, the Pythagorean theorem would die with Pythagoras. Hopefully somebody else will. Inevitably, I suppose somebody else would come along and discover it. But if you don't have something that can carry it out into the world, then it just dies. Yeah, so I write here, when God hears that men know his name, his corporeal form ascends. Why is God as man transfigured through the realization of his name in man's form? Why would God need to become something more holy through this naming? Right? Like if there's this ascension, if God is as a man and he goes through this sort of ascending process, but he's also God, why does he need to do this? And like I said, I'm trying to point to that back over here. It's because I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to say that the fundamentally sacred thing is transformation as such. Right? And it is sort of this like, well, I feel as though I'm put in a position where there's no other interpretation that I can adopt other than the fact that in some sense I am sanctifying God by virtue of the fact that I'm manifesting his name for me and trying to say it back at him. Yeah. And so I put this in quotes because this word is very loaded. I say it's as though a redemption of God through his image in man. Now, redemption is a very loaded word, so it's not necessarily this... I'm not sure that's the right word, but it is trying to capture this sort of looping structure that we're trying to build. Yeah. Yeah, and then I note this as a fulfillment of the law. Okay. this piece is heavy. Do you guys have questions? Yeah.
So if you say that transformation is like a fundamental thing, how does that make sense if you take into account, well, the name of Peter as the rock?
Oh yes, because it's as though he becomes something that doesn't transform at all. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this is a religious paradox, because what it's doing is it's pointing to, because what I can do is I can say transformation is the fundamental thing, right? But then the fact that I'm naming the transformation as the fundamental thing, that thing becomes an invariant, right? You see what I'm saying? Because it's like this. If you're not careful about what you mean when you say, I'm going to sanctify transformation as the fundamental thing, then that implies that that thing dies immediately. Because if I say transformation is the fundamentally sacred thing, then that idea needs to be transformed into something else immediately, which means that no longer the transformation is the fundamental thing at all.
Well, it depends what you mean by transformation.
Right, yes.
So as you have higher and higher modes of transformation.
Yeah, it's a infinity category or something like this. Yeah. Yeah. No, yes. So I mean, I think yeah, so I mean, I understand that that's how you want to think about it, but again, if we flip it, and because I'm giving this lecture, we're going to do it my way. I say, well, okay, so what I'm trying to say here is that there's a property that I can rely upon that transcends all other properties in some sense, and that's the property that I can postulate morphisms or something like that, right? Or I can postulate transformations, or I can say the only thing I'm allowed to do is if you give me something, I can turn it into something else. Yeah. And then you ask questions about like, well, what happens when you act that property on itself? And what I say is that question doesn't make sense. Right. It's like, okay, so this is sort of an aside, but like back to that conversation we had months ago, where it's like you're trying to peel something out and then stick it back in to use it to analyze itself, which is not allowed. Yeah. It's like God trying to do analysis on God in the absence of man. It's like because it's as though if in God's act of creating the world, he needed to do that to project himself into that thing so he could do self-analysis, because he fundamentally lacks the capacity to turn in on himself. Right? That's why you need something like this, is what it seems to me. Yeah. Does that make sense?
So that's a different question.
Oh, okay.
But I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So why is it that we have at least 3 stories about God giving a name to an individual, but not stories about God giving a name to a group of people?
I don't. Okay. There might be stories in the Old Testament in which that actually occurs. I'm not sufficiently competent on the Old Testament to argue that it's definitely, that framing is the right framing. It's difficult to say. I mean, look, in principle, you could argue that this is a simultaneity of giving a different name to an individual, but also a naming of a people. Right? Because especially if you read the Old Testament, Israel is referred to as the Jewish people, the nation, this particular person, a bunch of things. That being said, that doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen here. I mean, if I were to speculate on an answer to your question, why does God act that way? Again, what I would say is, well, I think that what we should do is we should say, it's true, if this is my empiricism, or if this is my body of facts, then the facts say that God just doesn't do that. Then we can ask the question of, well, what does it mean that God doesn't do that, right? And so if I ask the question, well, what does it mean that God doesn't give names to groups of people, but rather than individuals, then I would say it's because this relationship necessitates a fundamentally individual relationship. It's because the way that you're endowed with a name isn't through the externalities, that is a mechanism into which you project your name so that you can understand your name. But fundamentally, your name is something that comes from within you, right? And so that necessitates a fundamentally individual relationship. Now, I suppose you could argue that that's an introverted point of view, and fair enough, it is. Yeah, I mean, it would. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, why wouldn't something like God telling a group of people, "You guys are communists"? Why isn't that something consistent?
Right. Oh, okay. I see where you're trying to go with this. Yeah. Okay. I mean, again, I don't particularly like the framing of that question. I understand why you're framing it that way, but I don't like the framing of the question in that particular vein, because it seems to me that contradicts the data of, say, how we work, right? Because let me erase this and think about this, okay? Because the question that you're asking me necessitates me giving you a psychological answer rather than a religious answer, okay? And because the idea here is, well, this is God, and then suppose that we represent the group of people like this, then what you're saying is that God is in some sense endowing the totality of this thing uniformly with some property. Okay? But what I would say is that if I cut this off and then just look at the dynamics of this thing, I would say that rarely do we see the emergence of a particular psychological datum homogeneously throughout the totality of a group of people. So what I mean by that is, I don't think that there's ever been a situation ever in the totality of human history where a collective of people all get the exact same psychological idea at exactly the same time. What it seems to me like what happens is, it's much more like this thing is partitioned. So this is like me smearing this out. If I take this thing and actually I like fine tune it, it's really partitioned like this. Okay? And each of these guys have their own property. And then in a quasi-Darwinian fashion, the one that is the best conquers all the other ones. Okay. Look, I'm being hand-waving. But the thing that I'm trying to articulate here is that there are going to be ideas, or there are going to be psychological states, psychic frames, that are more influential than other psychic frames, and you have these things like this. You have interchanges between individuals, and you also correspondingly then have interchanges between psychic frames. Okay. The only way for this to occur is if all of these things become the same psychic frame simultaneously at some point in time. And what I would say is, well, I just don't know of any data where that's true. So I'm constructing this point of view on the basis of the fact that I've never observed that piece of data. And if we knew of a situation where that occurred, then that would radically alter our point of view. But it seems to me that if I treat this thing empirically, it just reinforces this point of view. And this point of view also seems to me to be the one that enables an effective explanation of how people work.
So say like God revealing something to 100,000 people, 100,000 chosen people, is not something that is psychologically consistent.
You mean simultaneously? It's like
Not necessarily simultaneously.
No, simultaneously. I mean, not necessarily simultaneously. Well, then, no, it is psychologically consistent, I would say. Right? That's how you can have multiple prophets for the Jewish people. I mean, I don't mean the prophet. I mean like Isaiah, Ezekiel.
I mean more like moments.
Oh, sure. Oh, okay. No, I mean, look. If the sort of intuition you have in mind is, yeah, God's standing at the door. He's saying, "Come all in, okay, everybody, sit down. Okay, here you go." You're all transfigured simultaneously. Yeah, no, I don't think it works like that. Now, that being said, what the hell are we doing here? In some sense, I'm kind of transfiguring you. Like this is me evangelizing you in some sense, right? But the fact of the matter is that he revealed this to me because obviously, like I said last week, I'm a prophet and the last one, so. All you have to do is know that I speak the truth, and just do what I say. I'll never lead you astray, my wonderful lambs. Yeah.
Because even in the beginning, even conscience is given to Adam, not to humans.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and like I was going to say, the other example that I thought of was, God didn't bring all of Israel up onto Mount Sinai and have the burning bush burn in front of all of them. No, he brought up Moses and the other guy. What's his name? Yeah, Moses and Aaron, right?
Oh yeah. He was there.
Dude, why does everybody forget about Aaron? I don't know. It's okay. I think it was because of that Disney movie. Did you guys watch that Disney movie? Have you guys seen? Okay. There's it's called The Prince of Egypt. Or, I'm not sure if it's Disney or maybe it's something else, but I think it's Disney. It's called The Prince of Egypt. It's the story of Moses, and Aaron is not in that movie at all. So I always forget about him. It's terrible. But, yeah.
There's a this gathering is like a microcosm of like the transformation that happened with Simon and Peter, I'd say.
Okay, say more. Okay.
So
for the camera, my dad watches these. He likes them, so he wants me to repeat the things.
Yeah.
So somebody in the audience said that this gathering is like a microcosmic representation of the transformation of Peter. So, go ahead.
So in some instance, you might have a more clear and articulate understanding of that which speaks to you that is most like God.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah, that's your name.
You do your obligation.
Yes, that's right.
To share that with
Yes, that's right.
people who might have a sense of
Yes.
that and are simultaneously
Yes.
a stable source.
Yes, that's exactly
now,
right.
What
Yes.
that
Yeah.
condemns you to in terms of your analytical framework, I'm not so sure. And perhaps there's also some, I wouldn't say handicap to that, too. Maybe that's just the burden of responsibility with this
Yeah, I mean, we're getting... So...
analysis, but
All right, you're taking me in a direction that I'm not going to go too far into because...
And please don't.
No.
This was just like an observation.
No. You're
There's a lot here.
You're 100% in going in the right direction. The problem is that you're taking me in a direction of ideas that I'm not solid on. But basically speaking, essentially, what I would say is, because that last comment that you made about it's my duty or it's my responsibility, I think that's correct. It's my responsibility to speak my name into the world. But the reason why I would say I think that's my responsibility is because I think that's what men are supposed to do. But I don't want to talk about the relationship between men and women and God right now. You can probably...
Focusing solely on the individual.
No.
Regardless of that.
No, yeah, but the problem is that that doesn't exist in a vacuum, unfortunately. If you're sufficiently intelligent and sufficiently aware, you can probably infer my thoughts on that particular topic. I'm not going to go there right now, but maybe later. Yeah.
So this makes a whole lot of sense to me. I think you're really barking up a good tree here.
Okay.
But I just want to make sure we're on the same page here.
Sure.
The transformation thing makes sense to me if you enter into a state of somewhat constant transformation throughout your life.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
And
right.
It's not like a one-time.
No.
And I think just one more observation.
Some of them are more powerful and more
yeah.
significant than others, right? And I think that these examples here are to stand out as like representative cases that we can analyze to see how they occur in our lives.
And I think as you look at Peter going through the early church, obviously that church went through different struggles and problems, and he had to, in some sense, transform.
Yeah, and Paul too, right? Like this is the point of the epistles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that another observation I think can be made that sort of backs up what you're saying is that, and I've mentioned this a lot, but with the old law, the ignition between the sacred bond between man and God was through a moment of sacrifice of something else. Like, I'm sacrificing this one thing.
Yeah.
After we
Yeah, and it also becomes something outside of you too, right?
Yeah, right. And after we receive the Holy Spirit,
A piece of rock,
right?
incidentally.
Yeah. And once-
2 pieces of rock, actually.
Yeah. Once we receive the Holy Spirit and Christ's sins, we're commanded to. The sacrifice turns from something outside of ourselves to literally ourselves.
Yes.
Sacrifice ourselves to God.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah, that's literally what this is. Yeah, I 100% agree. 100% agree, yeah. No, I do think that if you stare deeply enough into this, then what you realize that what this becomes is an inherently sacrificial process. And the nature of that sacrificial process is, I'm going to give my time now for God. This is the idea of, what does Jesus say? Something about cultivate your gifts in heaven.
Yeah.
Right, something like that, right? That is what this is, right? It's like you understand the idea. Like, I mean, look, if I really want to be stupid about it and simplify it, I say, oh, you understand the principle of delayed gratification, something like that, But yes, I do think that it's a constant submission.
And I think it's a sacrifice too of our earthly name as we want it to be.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm Ethan. I like bicycles.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, we'll go find some nice Latin name that means maker of bikes, and we'll name you that. There you go.
Appreciate it. But it's a laying down the sacrifice of that too.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So this is like the common trope of crucify your ego or get rid of your ego or stop being so egotistical. And I mean, when people, that's like a very shallow trope that I don't think people spend nearly enough time analyzing because they don't really understand what the ego is.
Yeah.
But
and I think that's also why when Jesus asked the rich young ruler to sell everything he has, that's why he feels profoundly sad. But now I have to transform.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's like he's being made aware of this and what the central fulcrum of this thing is, which is sacrifice. Yeah, definitely.
And his reaction to that is
Yeah.
sadness.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, what God is saying to you is like, well, you're going to have to endure tragedy, and it's going to be the worst tragedy you can endure. Pick up your cross and follow me. Let's go. We're marching up the mountain to our deaths. Yeah.
Everyone will hate you on the way.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, and it's not even that. It's not even that. It gets worse, right? Because once you get up there, you're going to have 2 of the worst possible people you could find making fun of you for the fact that you're up there dying too.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I think what you said also.
Yeah, you're gonna be surrounded by people that are just like, yeah, you suck.
Yeah, well, is that not why you made the distinction that you share with people who are like a stable source who kind of
Name calling, by the way.
Yeah, maybe why, right? You don't cast your pearls before swine.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's actually a beautiful point that you brought up with respect to freeing us from the law, because that's exactly what I'm going to talk about now. Yeah. So I discovered this, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, and I was so blown away by it. I just can't unsee this connection, but I don't find any etymological evidence for these 2 words being like connected. But it's bizarre to me that they're not. So if you look at the Greek words, the way the Greek words get translated in this as name and law, the word for name is onoma, and the word for law is nomos, which is very close to each other. Now, this word is derived from, I didn't put it here. This law is from nemo, which means to dispense, allot, distribute, possess, appropriate, inhabit, manage, pasture, graze, consume. So it's like to take for yourself or to live in, right? It's like claiming land, building a farm on it, and cultivating the land in some sense. Yeah. Name is related to call and proclaim. Right. And so again, this is sort of like this idea of naming is sort of like this action that I've been talking about, of the action of the Spirit in us is manifesting proclamation of God's law inside of us. Something like that, right? And so these two things sound so similar to me. And then when I take these 2 words and then I compare this thing to Ezekiel 11, 19 to 21, which I'm going to read, but it's the famous verse where he talks about turning your heart of stone into heart of flesh, right? He says this, This is Ezekiel testifying to what the Lord is saying to him. And so the eyes here are God speaking through Ezekiel. So he says, I will give them an undivided heart and put a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. So in other words, that is taking this principle and breathing life into it. Like making it a living principle, right? And again, there's this juxtaposition of rock and life, which is sort of the inversion of what I was trying to say to you earlier, right? Where what he's saying is, I'm taking a rock and I'm turning it into a living being. But what I was trying to say earlier was, we're taking this living principle and we're trying to say that that's the thing that transcends everything. And by that, it becomes a quote-unquote rock. They will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. But as for those whose hearts are devoted to their vile images and detestable idols, I will bring down on their heads what they have done, declares the sovereign Lord. Yeah, right? So it's like the dissolution of dogma, of the necessity to have law outside of you, to know that your name is the thing that comes from within, fundamentally from within. Right? That is your law. It's like the natural law that makes you who you are. It's like a compulsion. It's not something that you have a choice about. Right? And when we if you go and you read, for example, Cicero has a work called On the Laws, in which he tries to talk about, from a Roman point of view, what laws are. And what he says is something like, a law is an attempt to codify the truths that the gods have given to us into our society so that we may live by those things. Right? And if you guys remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago where I was talking about there being fundamentally something sacred that binds all of these things together, and that we act out of duty to preserve that connection. Right? Like God manifests himself here, and we act in a way to try and preserve it. Right? That is you abiding by the law. Right? But we don't need, I don't need to be like, oh, this is the old ancient law that no one knows how to read. No, it's in you. Yeah. Oh, by the way, you read it this way. Yeah. Yeah. There's no old ancient stone that you go look at anymore.
So could we interpret the law as this first arrow, God talking to group?
Yeah, I would say that this is the instantiation of the law okay. Sort of. I would say that the right way to put it is like this. God talking to the individuals who are then endowed with interactions. This is the instantiation of the law in them, and the propagation of the law through them. Yeah, because maybe you're trying to come up with a way where this is justified, right?
Maybe that looks like Judaism, for instance.
Oh, Judaism? Yeah, but every story that we have in Judaism always has something like this, right? Like Adam. Well, I don't know. I suppose Eve. Right? Let's see. Moses, Abraham, Noah, David, Samuel. I think so. I think it's always this picture, which is, incidentally, this would be consistent with this picture that I drew, right? Where you have Christ as the facilitator, right? So Christ is sort of the archetypal abstraction, archetypal idealization of this process. Yeah. And then also, incidentally, the sanctification of this individual. which is then the sanctification of the individual as such, which is then the sanctification of this process, which then establishes this. Yeah, so all of this follows naturally, see?
Even the property of truth being unique.
Yeah, right, because the question is your truth versus my truth, right? Yeah.
Which is solved by God talking to truth.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can think of a cheeky way to answer that, which is, well, forget about the religious shit. Oh, damn it. Forget about the religious side of things, and then just go to the psychological side of things and the biological side of things, right? Oh, you're endowed with a priori structure, so these exchanges have constraints upon them.
Well, we're doing synthesis, right?
Yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah, so I'm not sure, I'm actually not sure how to solve the problem if I remain in the framework of the religious structure. I think that it has something to do with this picture. Yeah, because like it's in a weird way, this individual then becomes fundamentally unique. In a weird way. Yeah, he becomes fundamentally unique, but then he also becomes like profoundly typical, like archetypical, right? Right, and so he just becomes one of an infinitude when this happens. It's like he becomes the identity, and then you have smooth translations to everybody else, right? And so it's all equivalences all the way down. Yeah. For you guys, that just means that this becomes the representative of all possible descriptions, and then the way that you get to this, the way that you do this, is always invertible. So, again, this was like when I was arguing, I think last week, where really you only have to do, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, you really only have to do analysis on yourself to understand the truth. Yeah. Okay, so great. We developed all of that machinery in the context of the religious side of things, but I always have this stupid demon in the back of my head that's like pulling me back to the secular world, and I'll never kill that thing. He's always going to be there. So I always have to answer the doubting Thomas, or I don't know. Who's a good representation of that these days? I would say Christopher Hitchens, but he's dead, so it doesn't matter. I could also say Sam Harris, but I don't respect him, so.
Who's the other guy? A blind watchmaker. Who wrote that book?
Oh, Dawkins?
Dawkins, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you go. He'll never be evangelized. The devil has his heart. It's okay. Okay. So again, if I take a step back and I think about that sort of picture that I drew at the beginning where I have these two sides, if we forget about everything that we learned over the past hour or so, and just look at it from the psychological lens, Jung was asked to write about the idea of development of personality because he spent his whole life investigating that in particular. And at the end of the day, what he discovered was it seems like how people function is as though there's some kind of fundamental aim inside of them that they're trying to articulate. And it comes about through, say, the type of job they end up choosing, the sort of people they end up surrounding themselves with, the sort of dreams they have, what they resonate with, why they like certain stories, why they like certain pieces of art. All of that they accumulate in their life is in an effort to articulate something that's fundamentally true about being them, that makes them unique, that makes them an individual. And that is his idea of individuation. And so he elevates this particular status, this idea of vocation to a status of, that is like the action, the thing I do in the world that articulates that thing inside of me. Yeah. And then Jung says that there is an archetype called the self, which is the thing that you're trying to differentiate, and that everybody has one of those things. It's an a priori property of your psyche, right? And so then, I mean, some people are better and some people are worse at it. Some people get stuck in certain stages of development, but at the end of the day, everybody is trying to fundamentally articulate who they really are, right? So Jung writes this. This is what is commonly called vocation, an irrational factor that destines a man to emancipate himself from the herd and from its well-worn paths. True personality is always a vocation and puts its trust in it as in God, despite its being, as the ordinary man would say, only a personal feeling. But vocation acts like a law of God from which there is no escape. And then he remarks a little bit later, the original meaning of to have a vocation is to be addressed by a voice. Yeah. I didn't put it up here, but in the same part of this particular essay, he also talks about how many people act as though, it's what I want to do, or as though I've chosen it. But the men who are truly aware of their vocation know that it's not that way at all. It's much more like they get up in the morning and it happens to them and they don't know why, they just know that they have to do it. And they're tortured if they don't. Or they'll die if they don't, in the worst case scenario. Or they kill themselves. Yeah. And I remark this here. We do not choose this vocation or what we individuate into so much as it chooses us. Right? And the example that I always think of is like, why in the heck does this resonate with me and not that? Like, why am I here doing this with you people? Why am I not doing something else? And the only answer that I can ever come to is, well, there's something about this that I don't understand that I feel absolutely compelled to do. I don't know why, I just know that that's true, And it doesn't, I want to stress here that it's not going to be a grandiose thing for everybody. That's not the principle. The principle is, there are some people that are just completely content with, say, building a log cabin in the middle of nowhere and living out their days by themselves in isolation in some sense. But that is, in some sense, their vocation. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just as true for them. That's their law, you see? They just know that if they don't do that, they'll go crazy. Or if they try to do something else, they'll go crazy. They don't fit themselves into boxes that aren't theirs. And they can't tolerate being put into boxes that aren't theirs. Yeah, and so I say here, the development of personality or individuation then amounts to differentiation of this inner law. This becomes the subjective motivating factor in man, as his will to life, as his fundamental purpose. Okay, so given everything that I was talking about with respect to name and law and transformation earlier, I hope that it's clear the direction that I'm trying to take us in from the psychological point of view is what this means, right? So if I go there, then what I say is, so I should have flipped these. I want to look here first. And I said the fundamental conjecture, the principal conjecture here is this, which I think the evidence stands to support. That to know one's God-given name is equivalent to differentiating one's personality. Okay? That means that what I'm saying here is that in this religious text, in this religious data, we are describing a process that's descriptive of what it means to be human. A psychological process. So again, like last week. We're talking about something real. Becoming who you are, which is a psychological mechanism, is equivalent to becoming that which God has called you to, which is the religious mechanism. Right? And then the flavor that the religious mechanism adds is it says, no, it's your sacred duty to articulate your name into the world. Like, you should regard that as the most holy thing in your life. Yeah. And so this idea then that this is inside of us, if we compare that with what Paul says to us in Romans, which I'm going to read to you right now. 7:4-6. Paul says this, "So, my brothers, you also died to the law through the body of Christ, that you might belong to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit to God. For when we were controlled by the sinful nature, the sinful passions aroused by the law were at work in our bodies, so that we bore fruit for death. But now, by dying to what once bound us, we have been released from the law, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit, and not in the old way of the written code." This is dogma. This is bullshit in some sense. Now, it's trying to point to this, or this, wherever you want to call it, wherever it is. But every external representation is an imperfect representation of the thing that's inside of you. And that's your name. You find it out here. These things help you constellate things inside of you to name yourself, to hear your name. But you're never going to find it outside. That's what this means. Go.
So I suppose using this conjecture, you would say that Peter couldn't become Simon again.
Yeah.
So what's the use of a story like Lucifer becoming Satan?
Okay. That's a good one. I have to sit down and think. Okay, naively what I would say there is that I would suppose that, again, look, so I always have to take it back to the point of view where Lucifer becomes Satan, and as far as we know, he doesn't transform back. That's what the data give us. What does that mean? The conclusion I would draw there is it is an invariant property of being. The falling from grace is an invariant property of being. Right? So that means that we need to represent, okay, in order for there to be, okay, let's do this. How do I represent this? Okay, in the alchemical literature, is it the alchemical literature? Yes. In the alchemical literature, you start like this, you go down. Incidentally, I think this is what Nietzsche means by when he says Zarathustra goes under. But I can't support that right now, but that's fine. You go down into this state called the Nigredo, which I talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, which is basically like a type of depression. It doesn't matter the details. The fact is that you go down. And then you come back up. And in principle, you're holy because you found the Philosopher's Stone. There's a lot of details in this that I'm glossing over. Doesn't matter. The point is that there's a redemption. Okay? So you go down and then come back up. You see what I'm saying? All right. The purpose of Lucifer, Lucifer becoming Satan, is to say that this is a transcendental property. And I need a way to represent this thing. And the way that we know how to represent this thing is to project that into into a narrative or a human structure. And so we need to have somebody who is fallen from grace that remains fallen from grace in order to point to the fact that this thing is always part of this. Right? Because what you're saying is, well, why can't Lucifer do this? And the answer is if Lucifer were able to do this, then no one would ever have to do this. Like, we could just have this.
Isn't that what Peter did?
I wouldn't say that he increased in holiness.
Who, Peter?
Yeah, Simon Peter.
Oh,
I wouldn't
okay.
say that at all.
No. Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful here because we have to start asking questions about, well, what do we mean by sanctification or becoming holy?
For
Right?
instance, when you were drawing that diagram, that quadrature, right?
Uh-huh.
How would you draw Simon Peter on that? It's not clear.
No. Yeah, in that particular diagram, I don't think that you could. It's like you need a third dimension. No, see, the reason why is because this idea of high to low and dark to light isn't what's happening in the case of Peter, I don't think. Peter, I mean, you could say that Peter is becoming sanctified by the fact that I don't know how to say this in words. The image that I have is something like this. He goes from a point to a base, right? It's like he goes from the tip of a cone to the base of the cone because he becomes a foundation of a people. I mean, and I guess in a way you could say that's sort of like what happens with Jacob to Israel, but it's not the same because Jacob has an inherent darkness to him. And I mean, there is a darkness to Peter, but it's more like an immaturity that you see in his stories.
Because based on the story that you read, it doesn't seem that Simon struggled to get his name.
No, yeah, that's right. Yeah. I don't think, well,
The other two did.
yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, that's because the first two are Jewish.
but don't you think, I don't know, maybe he didn't struggle, but he's taken quite a strong leap by admitting or acknowledging
I agree with that.
Jesus is the Christ.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Particularly in a world
Yeah.
where Christ was saying, don't tell people this because they'll come kill you.
Yeah.
And he's
Yeah.
being the first one to step out.
Yeah.
So he knows he's potentially sacrificing everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's also something non-trivial in the fact that he needs to be reinstated. It's like sort of this whole structure gets reinverted. It's like,
What's the constant?
yeah, I can't make this more precise. That's a really good question. I can't make this more precise. I have an intuition about this, but I can't make this more precise right now. But loosely speaking, I think that it has to do with the fact that Peter has to get reinstated corresponds to a type of falling from grace and a redemption, but that redemption arc for Peter is contingent upon his naming the Christ, rather than the other way around. What does that mean? I'm not sure. But yeah, it's like there's some kind of it's like there's some kind of duality there that I can't quite see. Like it's like instead of going through the suffering to earn your name, something about getting your name instantiates the suffering that enables you to be redeemed. Yeah, but I can't make it more precise than that.
Well, it seemed to me that the suffering after getting his name was more like an indication of this, that transformation is not like a punctual event, but that it keeps going. I thought that's what that meant.
Okay. I think that's a plausible hypothesis, definitely. Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah.
It's not like, well, okay, I'm
You're
here
done.
now, then,
Yep.
okay, then what?
Yeah, right. I can go home, lie down, and die. Yeah. I think that's, I definitely think that's a reasonable, I think that's definitely a reasonable hypothesis. And the data, it seems to me that the data bear that out too, so yeah, for sure. Okay. Do you guys have other questions? Cool.